When fear paralyzes you, find the root and recover your courage. There are fears that scream and fears that stay silent. The silent ones are the most dangerous. They do not arrive with noise or violence, but settle inside quietly, taking root beneath your ribs until you forget they're even there. They do not destroy you at once. They steal your life piece by piece. They whisper with soft persistence, telling you that safety is wisdom and risk is foolishness. They convince you that danger waits outside when in truth you've been carrying it all along. I remember the day I realized fear had taken control. It wasn't after a tragedy or crisis. There was no sudden blow, no disaster to name. It began with something smaller, almost invisible, a strange exhaustion, a subtle sense of being trapped in a life that had grown too small for my soul. I stopped doing simple things, speaking from the heart, taking small chances, dreaming out loud. Everything became hesitation. Better not. Maybe later. What if it goes wrong? And slowly, without even noticing, I began to surrender pieces of myself to the illusion of safety. My world became small, predictable, painless, but also joyless. It was a life without wounds, but also without healing. That is the genius of fear. It never calls itself fear. It puts on the mask of caution. It whispers, "Wait until you're ready." Not yet. There's no need to rush. And while you wait, life passes quietly beside you. Fear doesn't bind you with chains. It wraps you in doubt. One night, standing in front of the mirror, I saw a face I didn't recognize. It wasn't age that had changed me, nor time. It was the countless small retreats, the dreams postponed, the passions muted, the words I never dared to say. I had stopped being who I was, not because I'd failed, but because I'd stopped trying. What I saw reflected back wasn't fatigue or sadness. It was fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear of trying and failing again. Fear of standing up and realizing I no longer knew how. Fear grows ancient roots. Some stretch back to childhood, to moments when love was mistaken for approval, when affection was earned through obedience, when being ourselves led to correction. Others are planted later, in heartbreaks, betrayals, the quiet moments when we lost faith in the world's tenderness. We learn early that life can hurt, and so we build our walls. We call them wisdom, but they are only fear dressed up as control. I began to notice how fear had invaded everything, even my faith. I looked at the future with suspicion, at others with distance, and at God with reverence but not with trust. I didn't doubt His love. I doubted my worthiness to receive it. Fear had written its own theology in me, a God who loved, but whom I feared to disappoint. One night, weary of excuses, I said the simplest prayer I've ever said. God, I'm afraid of failing, of trying, of not being able. I said it raw, unpolished, unplanned, and it was the most honest prayer of my life. I expected silence, but something stirred inside me. A voice, barely audible, like the breath before dawn. Do not be afraid. I am within what you fear. That sentence pierced me. I didn't understand it completely, but something shifted. Maybe fear wasn't an enemy. Maybe it was a door, the one I had been too afraid to open. Maybe fear wasn't the end of faith, but the place where faith begins. From then on, I started to look at fear differently. When it came, I stopped running. I sat with it, I breathed through it, and I asked, "What are you trying to show me?" Sometimes there was an answer. I come from an old wound. Other times, only silence. But even that silence felt holier than the old escape. I learned that fear doesn't disappear when ignored. It dissolves when exposed to light. And that light is truth, the truth that you are not alone, that strength is not something you summon, but something you receive from the one who walks beside you. From that day on, fear didn't vanish, but it lost its throne. It still followed me, but smaller, less divine. I began to understand that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to move despite it. Faith doesn't mean never trembling. It means trembling while trusting. And from that understanding, a first ray of freedom was born. Fear never appears suddenly. It is planted quietly, almost tenderly, through small gestures, through silences that stay too long, through words that were never meant to wound, but that the soul still remembers. When we are children and someone yells at us for being wrong, we learn that failure is dangerous. When we reach for love and find none, we learn that affection is uncertain. When we cry for help and no one comes, the heart concludes that it is alone. That is how fear begins, not as a shout, but as a slow education. That root rarely dies easily. It buries itself deep, even after we tell ourselves, "I've healed." Because fear is clever, it wears disguises. It pretends to be prudence, perfectionism, control. We believe we're just being careful, but in truth, we are hiding. The need to have everything under control isn't ambition, it's insecurity dressed as order. The soul wants to avoid pain, and control is its fragile shelter. I began to see my own disguises. Behind every excuse, "I'm not ready," "I don't have time," "maybe later," there was a hidden tremor. Fear of failing again. Fear of being judged. Fear of reopening an old wound. And I realized something essential. Fear isn't defeated by force. It is undone by truth. Because only truth has the power to set the soul free. One day I read a phrase that struck me deeply. Fear is faith placed in the wrong direction. How much light in those few words. Fear, too, is a kind of belief, but it is belief in the opposite. It's faith in danger instead of safety, faith in the wound instead of the healer, faith in the world's cruelty instead of God's care. For years I had placed my faith in failure. Every morning I woke expecting the worst, as if preparing for pain could protect me from it. But fear doesn't prevent suffering, it prevents life. So I began to ask God, where does this fear come from? He didn't answer all at once. But over the following days, small memories began to rise like forgotten letters in the dark. A moment of shame, a lost friend, a broken promise. Each one carried the echo of a younger self who had learned to survive by closing doors. And I saw it clearly. Every current fear was the voice of an old wound asking to be heard. That realization changed everything. Fear, I learned, isn't an enemy to be crushed. It's a messenger, a fragment of yourself still waiting for compassion. The fearful parts of you don't need correction, they need comfort. So I began to do something new. When fear appeared, I didn't shout at it or pretend to be strong. I spoke softly to it. "It's okay to be afraid," I'd say. "You're not alone." Those simple words felt small, almost childish, yet they carried healing. Because fear loses its voice when it feels seen, when it feels accompanied. Then I began to understand that many of my fears weren't even mine. They were inherited. The quiet fears of my parents, of their parents, a whole lineage of people who learned that silence was safer than honesty. Fear can be passed down like language. It can hide in the tone of a sigh, in the way a door closes, in the eyes of someone who never says, "I'm proud of you." And when you carry ancestral fear, healing becomes an act of redemption. One night, in prayer, something became clear. God doesn't rip fear from the root. He transforms it. He doesn't erase the trembling of your hands. He teaches you to trust while they shake. He doesn't make you fearless. He makes your fear sacred. So I began to practice that. Each time fear came near, I whispered, "You walk with me." At first it felt forced. Then slowly, it became true. The fear stayed, but it no longer drove. Faith took the steering wheel, and fear became a passenger, still talking, still nervous, but no longer in charge. The root of fear, I discovered, is forgetfulness. Forgetting who you are, forgetting whose hands formed you, forgetting who sustains you when everything else disappears. Fear blooms wherever faith is forgotten. And so I understood that freedom doesn't begin with bravery. It begins with remembrance. Remember that you were created with purpose. Remember that your value doesn't depend on performance, but on the love that called you into being. Remember that fear may shout, but its words are lies. When I remembered, something inside me awakened. The fear was still there, but it no longer ruled the story. It had become smaller, humbler, something human rather than divine. Fear is an actor with many masks. It rarely arrives as panic. Sometimes it comes as logic, sometimes as humility. But beneath every costume hides the same root: mistrust. Mistrust in yourself, in others, in the future, and finally, in God. I started to notice it in small, ordinary things. In the way I loved, for example. It wasn't a lack of love that made me distant. It was fear of being hurt. I loved with caution, measured words, restrained tenderness. I longed for connection, but was terrified of exposure. And in that contradiction, fear stole what I most desired: closeness. Fear also crept into my dreams. Each time a new idea was born, a quiet voice whispered, "What if you fail?" And instead of answering with trust, I froze. I postponed. I analyzed. I called it prudence. But it was fear, clever, dressed in reason. That paralysis became familiar, almost comfortable. I began to adapt to it, to live half alive and call it stability. But that wasn't peace. It was resignation. One night, while reflecting, I understood something vital. Fear doesn't only stop actions, it stops the soul. It numbs belief itself. Because believing requires surrender, and fear cannot surrender. It demands control, guarantees, proof. But faith begins precisely where control ends. So I prayed again, "God, I want to trust, but I'm afraid of what might happen." And inside I felt a simple answer: don't trust what might happen. Trust who walks with you. Those words settled deep within me. Because faith doesn't erase uncertainty, it transforms it. Uncertainty without God is a threat. Uncertainty with Him is a promise. After that prayer, something began to change in the way I looked at my own fear. I no longer wanted to conquer it. I wanted to understand it. I began to face it gently, almost with curiosity. Each fear carried a memory. The fear of failure reminded me of a time I had fallen and never forgiven myself. The fear of rejection spoke about the day someone I loved turned away. The fear of loss echoed the many times I had confused possession with love. I began to see that every fear hides a story, and that most of those stories simply want to be heard. Then came a revelation I had never considered. We don't fear the future. We fear the past repeating itself. Our minds say, "I'm afraid of what's coming." But our hearts whisper, "I'm afraid of reliving what already hurt me once." Fear is memory disguised as prophecy. It tells you that pain will return, that you'll fail again, that you'll be left alone once more. But God doesn't repeat your past. He redeems it. Slowly I learned that fear isn't conquered through strength, but through love. Because love is the language fear cannot speak. It loses its power when love enters the room. Fear can't convince you that you're worthless when you feel truly loved. It can't stop you when you sense that you are accompanied. Fear lives off distance. Love lives off presence. One afternoon while reading scripture, a verse caught my attention in a way it never had before. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. Drives out. Not reduces, drives out. Not calms down, expels. It struck me that divine love doesn't coexist with fear. It replaces it completely. That truth didn't transform me overnight, but it began to work quietly, like roots growing under soil. I noticed small shifts, a word spoken without rehearsing it, a moment of honesty without anxiety, a prayer without the need to sound perfect. Simple things, but for someone once paralyzed by fear, they felt miraculous. Freedom began to take on a new meaning. It wasn't about being free from fear, but about being free from obeying it. The fear still appeared, but its commands no longer held authority. I began to understand that courage doesn't grow on the mountaintop. It grows in the trembling step you take on the way there. True courage isn't born from confidence, but from love. The kind of love that holds your shaking hand and says, "Move anyway." One night, beneath a vast and silent sky, I understood something sacred. Fear never leaves completely because it has a holy function. It reminds you of your need for faith. If everything were certain, faith would be unnecessary. So God doesn't remove fear. He redeems it. He transforms it into a teacher, not a tormentor, but a quiet instructor, showing you where trust still needs to grow. Since then, each time fear returned, I tried not to push it away. I opened the door. I let it sit across from me like an old friend who still makes me uncomfortable. And I said, "You can stay if you want, but you don't command me anymore." Because this heart, this house, has a new owner now. And in the silence that followed, I could almost feel God smiling. The first step to reclaiming courage, I learned, wasn't defeating fear, it was stopping the flight. When you stop running, fear loses its chase. Every time I faced it honestly, something in me opened, a hidden space where faith could breathe. Fear became a door, and behind that door I found God waiting, patient, steady, eternal. He had never been gone. I had simply been too afraid to meet him there. For years I believed faith meant never being afraid. But one day, walking alone under the rain, I realized the truth. Faith doesn't erase the storm. It teaches you to walk through it. Faith doesn't mean silence in the thunder. It means dancing while it roars. Courage isn't found in those who never tremble, but in those who keep walking while they do. Little by little, I began to see signs of divine presence everywhere. In a sunrise after a restless night, in a kind word from a stranger, in the timing of an embrace that arrived just when I needed it. I realized God doesn't always calm the storm. Sometimes he simply reminds you he's there in it. His presence doesn't always come as fire. Sometimes it comes as a quiet wind. And with that awareness, life began to change. I stopped asking God to give me strength. I started asking him to give me trust. Because strength still tries to control, but trust learns to let go. And in that surrender, I discovered a secret. Fear only has power over you while you believe everything depends on you. When you place the outcome back in God's hands, fear runs out of fuel, because fear feeds on the future, but faith lives in the present. One morning during prayer, I said, "Lord, I don't want a path without fear. I want a heart that no longer runs from it." And in that moment, something like peace, a living, breathing calm, settled in me. It wasn't the absence of fear, but the awareness of being held. Faith, I learned, isn't a guarantee of safety. It's a communion with trust. It's not believing everything will turn out right. It's knowing you will not be lost no matter how it turns out. From then on, I began to see fear as an invitation rather than a threat. Every time it appeared, I knew something sacred was being revealed, a desire too deep, a dream too real, a love too important. Because fear is the shadow of what matters most. Where there is great fear, there is also great purpose. And slowly, I began to give thanks. Yes, thanks for fear. Because through it, I had learned to pray more honestly, to love more humbly, to depend less on myself and more on God. Fear had once made me weak, but that weakness became the door through which divine strength entered. I began to speak to God with greater intimacy, not like a desperate beggar, but like a friend walking alongside me. I told him my fears as if they were confessions. Today I'm afraid to fail. And I heard within me, then trust me more. And little by little I realized that courage doesn't come before you act. It comes as you act. No one feels brave before taking the step. Bravery appears in the step. It is movement itself that dissolves fear. One day, as I stood by the ocean, watching the endless movement of the waves, I understood something that felt like revelation. The waves never stop coming, but they are never the same. Some strike hard, some arrive soft, yet all of them return to the same sea, and so do we. No matter how many times fear breaks us, we always return to the love that created us. From that day forward, I stopped seeing fear as an enemy. I began to see it as a compass, pointing toward the parts of my soul that still resisted surrender. Every fear revealed a lesson. If I feared losing something, it was because I was clinging too tightly. If I feared moving forward, It was because I trusted more in my weakness than in God's promise. Fear became a teacher, showing me where I still needed to let go, and every act of letting go became liberation. I started to understand something profound. God doesn't expect us to come to Him fearless. He invites us to bring our fear along. He doesn't demand perfection before presence. He desires honesty. The brave soul isn't the one without fear, but the one who dares to love and believe in the midst of it. One night while praying, I said from the depths of my soul, "Lord, if you use fear to teach me what I need to learn, I won't reject it anymore. Teach me to listen, but not to follow." From that moment, something changed. Fear stopped feeling like a prison and started feeling like a classroom. It still spoke, still whispered doubts, but now I knew its voice was only an echo, not the truth itself. It showed me my limits, but it no longer controlled my steps. Because now I knew, behind every fear there is an invitation, an opportunity for trust, a place where God waits patiently for surrender. And through that understanding, I realized that courage and faith are sisters. They are born not in the absence of danger, but in the very heart of it. They don't bloom when the light is clear, but when you walk through darkness with your hand in the unseen. Fear taught me more about God than comfort ever did, because only when you're standing at the edge of your own strength do you understand what it means to be held by grace. Only when you're trembling on the cliff of uncertainty do you discover what trust really is. I began to give thanks for the nights of anxiety, for the moments of silence, for the doors that never opened, because through them I learned to wait, and through waiting, I learned to believe. Gratitude slowly replaced resentment. Instead of asking, "Why am I afraid?" I began to ask, "What is this fear revealing about my heart?" And the answers were always gentle, like whispers in a quiet chapel. Sometimes the fear wasn't mine. It belonged to a past version of me still needing grace. Sometimes it was simply love in disguise, love for life, love for others, love for what could be lost, because we only fear what we care about. I began to see that fear itself was not evil, only the lies that grew inside it were. Fear was neutral, even sacred, when surrendered to God. Because God can use even the trembling to teach faith. I realized that the purpose of fear was not to paralyze, but to point. It points to the wound that needs healing. It points to the dream that still matters. It points to the place where faith is waiting to be reborn. Fear became the map to my healing. Each time it appeared, I no longer resisted. I said, "Show me what I still haven't trusted." And fear surprisingly obeyed. It revealed the corners of pride, the moments of control, the illusions of self-sufficiency. And through every revelation, God whispered the same thing, "Let me be enough." I began to see that fear itself could be redeemed. The same feeling that once suffocated me now reminded me to pray. The same trembling that once made me hide now led me to worship. Because every time I felt fear, it became an invitation to remember, I am not alone. Fear became my teacher, and God became its translator. Through fear, He taught me dependence. Through trembling, He taught me intimacy. Through uncertainty, He taught me faith. I began to see how every struggle of my life, every dark corridor, every unanswered question had been preparing me for this. To walk with fear without letting it lead me. To live aware of it, but no longer ruled by it. And the miracle was this. The fear didn't vanish. It simply lost its voice. It became small enough to fit inside a prayer. Because when you begin to speak to God about your fear, the fear itself starts listening. And when fear listens to faith, it changes shape. It turns from threat into truth. I realized that in the end, fear had a sacred purpose. It led me back to dependence, back to surrender, back to love. It brought me to the very threshold of God's presence, the place where I finally stopped pretending to be strong. And in that surrender, I found freedom. The freedom not from fear, but from the need to run from it. The freedom to tremble and trust at the same time. The freedom to love even when it hurts. For a long time, I thought peace meant not feeling afraid. But now I know peace means not being afraid of being afraid. It means knowing that even your weakness is safe in His hands. There came a moment, somewhere along this inner path, when everything grew quiet. Not because life became easy, but because my soul had learned to rest even in the trembling. That stillness wasn't born of certainty, it was born of surrender. It was the kind of peace that breathes beneath the storm, alive, tender, unbreakable. I remember the day I realized I was no longer afraid of fear itself. It didn't mean fear had vanished. It meant that I no longer interpreted its presence as a threat. When it came, I didn't flinch. I felt it, acknowledged it, and let it pass through. There was no fight, no flight, only acceptance. And in that acceptance I saw clearly, fear had never been the true enemy. My resistance to trust had been. For years I had searched for courage in my own strength, as if I could manufacture faith through effort, like trying to spark a flame with empty hands. But courage cannot be fabricated. It is received. It arrives in the quiet moment when you realize you cannot, and yet you move anyway. Not because you believe in yourself, but because you believe in the one who sustains you. Then I saw fear for what it really was, a hidden prayer. Every trembling was a whisper. Lord, I can't do this alone. Every anxious breath was an unspoken plea. Stay with me. Fear was not the end of faith. It was the beginning of a deeper one, because only those who have felt helpless truly understand dependence. And that dependence, far from weakness, became my greatest strength. I began to recognize a new kind of courage, not the fearless kind celebrated by the world, but the sacred kind born of humility. The courage of those who kneel before walking. The courage of those who love knowing they could lose. The courage of those who trust even when they don't understand. From that moment on, life began to feel different. Not lighter, but fuller. Challenges still came. Pain still visited. But fear had lost its voice of authority. It had become a reminder instead of a ruler. Each time I felt it stirring inside, I remembered, this too is holy ground. Because fear was no longer proof of absence. It was evidence of growth. I started walking with my eyes open, not looking for perfection, but for presence. I began to see God not only in the miracles but in the details, in the breath between words, in the silence after tears, in the ordinary beauty that once went unnoticed. Faith opened my eyes to the subtle ways the divine moves, through the gentle rhythm of daily life. I discovered that divine presence doesn't always arrive in light. Sometimes it comes as shadow. Sometimes God speaks not through the removal of fear, but through its endurance. He doesn't always calm the waters. He walks on them. And when you walk beside Him, even the waves become part of your lesson. There were days when fear returned with old intensity. Days when anxiety gripped my chest and memories whispered old lies. But this time I wasn't the same. I had learned to recognize the visitor. I would say quietly, you again. And instead of resisting, I would breathe, listen, and let peace rise slowly like dawn. Because now I knew something sacred. Freedom doesn't mean you never tremble again. It means you know who stands beside you when you do. Fear had once taught me caution. Now it taught me faith. It had once chained me. Now it guided me back to love. Through fear, I had found intimacy with God. Through trembling, I had learned to rest in His strength. Through loss, I had learned to find Him everywhere. And with that understanding came something like gratitude. I began to thank God for fear, yes, even for fear, because it had been His most patient messenger. It had pushed me toward surrender when pride would have kept me standing alone. It had softened me when self-sufficiency made me rigid. It had broken me open just enough for grace to enter. I realized then that fear had been part of the plan all along. God never caused it, but He allowed it to become holy ground. He never celebrated my trembling, but He used it to teach me dependence. Fear had been the soil where faith took root. Because faith doesn't grow in control, it grows in uncertainty. Faith doesn't bloom in light, It blooms in darkness, where trust becomes the only vision. That realization changed my entire relationship with fear. I no longer asked God to take it away. I asked Him to transform it. And He did, slowly, silently, mercifully. He turned panic into prayer, anxiety into awareness, trembling into trust. Through this transformation, I saw something beautiful. Fear had once been my greatest obstacle, and now it was my greatest teacher. It had introduced me to the real meaning of faith, not as belief without doubt, but as trust within doubt. Faith wasn't perfection of peace, it was persistence through trembling, and that kind of faith, fragile yet steady, was more real than anything I had ever known. One day I realized that every time fear had visited me, it had left behind a gift, a lesson, a truth, a new tenderness. Fear was no longer a thief. It had become a giver. It had stripped away illusions and replaced them with something lasting: humility. Because the heart that has been afraid and still believes is unshakable. I began to notice that fear, when transformed by love, becomes something gentle, almost sacred. It stops shouting and begins to whisper truth. It reminds you not of what you lack, but of who sustains you. It invites you to depend, to surrender, to rest. And in that transformation, I understood that every fear carries a purpose. It reveals the corners of the heart where light has not yet entered. Fear is not the enemy of faith. It is the invitation that awakens it. The places where we tremble are the very places where trust must grow. Looking back, I saw that the seasons I had feared the most were the ones that shaped me most deeply. The moments when I thought I was breaking were actually the moments I was being remade. Because faith does not grow in easy days. It grows in the nights when you fear losing everything and still choose to believe. God doesn't remove trials, but in each one He hides a seed, and that seed is purpose. The greatest fears often guard the greatest treasures. The fear to speak, to love, to change, to take a step. Each one stands before something holy waiting to be discovered. The enemy of the soul doesn't need to destroy you. He only needs to keep you still. But the moment you move, even trembling, the chains begin to fall. There was a day when I finally dared to do what I had postponed for years. Not because the fear was gone, but because I understood that waiting for its absence was waiting forever. So I stepped forward with shaking hands, a racing heart, and faith that barely fit inside me. And something miraculous happened. The fear lost its power. Because fear cannot survive in movement, it suffocates in action. It feeds on stillness, but dies in motion. That day marked the beginning of my transformation. I discovered that courage isn't a feeling. It's a decision made again and again, sometimes every minute, to trust, to continue, to rise, to take the next step even when your legs tremble. And then I saw it clearly. Fear was never an obstacle on the path. It was the path. Without fear, I would never have learned dependence. Without uncertainty, I would never have discovered grace. Without fragility, I would never have found the strength that comes from beyond myself. I remembered the words of Jesus. Do not be afraid, only believe. He didn't say, don't fear, because there's no danger. He said, don't fear, because faith will hold you even within it. Faith doesn't erase fear, it reorders it. When faith leads, fear becomes a signal, not a sentence. And I began to see how God had been using fear as a compass all along. It pointed to the places in me still chained by self-reliance. If I feared losing something, it meant I had placed it above Him. If I feared failure, it meant I trusted my effort more than His grace. Each fear became a light pointing to an idol that needed to fall. Every surrender became a resurrection, because every time you release control, something dead inside you comes back to life. Then I realized something beautiful. God doesn't wait for you to be unafraid before He calls you closer. He meets you right in your trembling. He doesn't demand a brave heart. He asks for an honest one. He doesn't need your perfection. He desires your presence. The soul that admits its fear and still reaches out is already brave. And when you bring your fear to Him, He doesn't scold you. He sits with you. He listens. He stays, and in that quiet companionship, fear begins to soften. It no longer feels like punishment, but invitation. From that night on, fear became a counselor instead of a captor. It showed me where I was still learning to trust, but it no longer held me hostage. Now I could look at it and say, "Thank you for showing me where I need to grow." And fear would fade, its lesson complete. That's how I learned that courage and faith are not opposites. They are twins, born from the same mystery, growing side by side. Not in clarity, but in darkness. Not in power, but in surrender. Faith gives courage its breath, and courage gives faith its shape. Fear taught me the deepest truths I know about God. It taught me that His presence isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the stillness holding you when you shake. It taught me that His strength isn't about removing fear, but about redeeming it. And it taught me that dependence, once seen as weakness, is actually the greatest form of freedom. Because when you depend completely, nothing can threaten you. Not loss, not rejection, not failure. For you know that none of it can separate you from His love. In time, gratitude began to grow even in the places where fear had once ruled. I thanked Him for the nights of anxiety, because they taught me how to pray. I thanked Him for the doors that stayed closed, because they taught me to trust timing. I thanked Him for the tremors that made me feel weak, because they reminded me I was held by someone stronger. Now I see fear not as a curse, but as an instrument, a tool God used to shape me, refine me, and bring me back to Him. Without it, I would have never known what it truly means to rely on grace. There came a day, I remember it clearly, when I looked back at all the fears that once ruled me. They felt like distant shadows now, fading at the edge of memory. And instead of sadness, I felt gratitude, because without them, I would never have discovered the kind of peace that needs no reason. The peace that isn't born from certainty, but from presence. The peace that doesn't depend on what happens, but on who is with you through it all. I realized then that fear had completed its work. It had led me to the place where faith became flesh, where love became strength, and where fragility became testimony. It had taught me how to walk with trembling steps and still call it trust. So now, when fear knocks on my door, I don't hide anymore. I open the door, I let it in. I tell it, "You may stay, but you don't command this house, because this home belongs to another." And in that silence that follows, I can almost feel God smiling, because fear once paralyzed me, yes. But faith taught me how to walk.